A woman in her 50s once told me on a rainy afternoon in Vermont, "I spent my whole life searching for the light. But when the light came, I found myself standing in the void." She didn't cry, she didn't panic. There was only a strange silence, as if life had just taken something from her that she hadn't even realized she was carrying all along. Before that, she had gone through a major turning point, a spiritual awakening no one had warned would hurt that much. No more old dreams, no more goals to chase and finish, only a quiet emptiness and a question echoing in her mind. Am I truly living or merely drifting? If you've ever felt something within you begin to shift, if you've ever gone through a profound awakening only to find yourself feeling empty, lost, and unsure of which direction to take next, then this video is for you. Today we'll explore one of the most misunderstood phases of the awakening journey, the phase that comes after you've seen the truth, but don't yet know how to live with it, where old motivations have faded, but new ones have yet to emerge. A place Jung called the sacred pause of the soul, but what the modern world labels as being lost. Before we dive into the heart of the topic, if there's ever been a quiet voice inside you saying, "I no longer feel the drive to keep pushing forward, but I also don't want to give up on myself," then take 3 seconds to hit subscribe, because in this video you won't just find understanding, you'll find a deeper part of yourself finally being named. Let's begin with a paradox. Why is it that the more awakened we become, the more we tend to feel empty? And could it be that this emptiness isn't a sign of being lost, but the beginning of a journey toward living truly, deeply, and fully? There is a part of the awakening journey that few people talk about, not because it's unimportant, but because it's incredibly hard to put into words. Most of us are told that when you awaken, you'll see the truth clearly, live with purpose, and feel enlightened. But what few prepare you for is the collision that follows the light. Not a loud, violent crash, but a quiet impact that arrives in silence. Not a breakdown, but the silent dissolution of all the things you once believed yourself to be. I once knew a man, David, in his 60s, who seemed to have lived a fulfilling life, a stable family, a solid career, and a strong Christian faith. Then one day, during a week-long retreat, he experienced what he called a gentle collapse. He said, "It felt like someone had just taken off the glasses I'd been wearing for 40 years, and for the first time I saw life not through the lens of habit or obligation." In that moment, he didn't feel exhilarated, he felt deeply quiet. But then the quiet gradually turned into emptiness. He returned home, looked over everything he had built, and quietly asked himself, "What have I lived my whole life for?" This is something many people experience after awakening. You begin to see the meaninglessness of the things that once drove you every day: fame, accomplishments, recognition. And when those no longer persuade you, a silence sets in. It's the silence of not knowing where you're headed, not because you're lost, but because the old path has disappeared and the new one has yet to appear. The emptiness that follows awakening is not a mistake. It's a sign that you've gone deep enough to remove the mask, and now your soul needs time to discover its true face. There is nothing wrong with not feeling immediate motivation. There is nothing wrong with not knowing what's next. In fact, this is the moment when you're truly stepping into the real journey. But if the old has dissolved, then what remains? If the ego no longer steers you as it once did, then what is now at the wheel? Let's move into the next part, where we explore a commonly misunderstood truth. The ego doesn't die, it just loses its script. And that's when you must learn to rewrite the script of your life from the deepest place within. When people talk about awakening or ego dissolution, we often imagine something definitive and absolute, as if the ego will completely disappear and you'll step into a new life light, at ease, and free of conflict. But that's a half myth. Carl Jung once said, "You don't get rid of the ego, you integrate it." The ego doesn't die, it doesn't vanish, it simply loses its script. I remember an old friend named Susan. She was once the principal of a prestigious high school, highly respected in her community. She dedicated her life to education, raised 2 children, and lived with the belief that a person's value lies in their contribution. Then, after retiring, she attended a mindfulness course, at first just out of curiosity. But in that prolonged stillness, something within her snapped open. She looked back at all those years of working like a dutiful soldier and realized, I lived to fulfill a role, but I never asked who wrote the script. After the final session, she wrote a line in her journal that she later shared with me. I don't know who I am when I'm no longer someone who's supposed to be useful. This is what happens when the ego is no longer being fueled. It feels confused, disoriented, not because it's bad, but because the old script no longer fits. It once knew how to perform in order to be loved, to be recognized, to be needed. But when you awaken, you begin to see that recognition is fleeting, and being needed isn't the same as being truly loved. You no longer see a reason to perform, but you still don't quite know what it means to live authentically. You don't need to destroy the ego. You just need to sit with it and rewrite the script. Not as the lead in a social performance, but as the narrator of your own true story. The ego doesn't need to be eliminated. It needs to be transformed into a servant of the self, the deeper essence within. Like a seasoned actor who finally realizes that their worth doesn't lie in the role they play, but in the heart behind the story they tell. But when you clearly see that you're no longer playing the role you once did, when the applause no longer sweeps you away, when the stage lights have gone out, what then lifts you up each morning? That's when you enter the quietest, strangest phase, where everything seems to dissolve and you start to think you're stopping. But the truth is, you're not lazy. You're in the chrysalis. Let's keep going into the next part of the journey. There is a phrase I often hear from those who've awakened, spoken with a sad gaze. I can't seem to do anything anymore. I've lost my drive. Am I becoming lazy? And I always want to place a hand on their shoulder, smile, and say, no, you're not lazy. You're in the chrysalis. In nature, there's a stage few truly pay attention to. Before a butterfly takes flight, it doesn't simply take a nap. It melts. Inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar's body literally dissolves into liquid, becoming a formless biomass, no longer a caterpillar, not yet a butterfly. And it is precisely in that uncertainty, that uselessness, that invisibility, that new life begins to take shape. I once worked with a man named Richard, 58 years old, formerly the CEO of a top tech company, constantly flying from city to city, packed with meetings, always busy. After a family crisis and a period of serious meditation, Richard began to withdraw. He stopped working, didn't check emails, lost all interest in multi-million-dollar projects. He spent his time reading, walking by the lake, and doing nothing. And then, during one of our conversations, he said something I'll never forget. I'm not doing anything, but I've never felt more alive, though at times I feel like I'm wasting my time. I looked at him and replied, no, Richard, you're in the chrysalis, and inside you something is forming even if you can't see it yet. The truth is, modern culture teaches us that stopping means laziness, that not producing results means lacking value. But Jung and other depth psychologists have made it clear there are phases in life when the most important thing you can do is to do nothing. No chasing, no proving, no rushing, just being still, and allowing the old to dissolve so the new can emerge. The fact that you're not running right now doesn't mean you're falling behind. It might be a sign that your soul is busy building wings, and sometimes only in deep stillness and true patience can beauty rise from the depths. But within that stillness, there's something that frightens many. The feeling of emptiness, a nameless void where you no longer know who you are and no longer feel driven to do anything. Is it depression, or is it a different kind of transformation that science doesn't yet have words for? Let's step into the next part. Awakening versus depression. Know the difference. Because this distinction could be the first light in your darkness. One of the most silent fears after awakening is the fear that am I depressed? You no longer feel excited about the work you once loved. You withdraw from conversations. The things that used to preoccupy you now no longer touch you. You feel empty, and the outside world calls it a lack of motivation, low productivity, or worse, a disorder. But pause for a moment and listen to the story of Linda, a 62-year-old woman who had been a literature teacher for 3 decades. When her husband passed away and her children had all left the nest, Linda embarked on a deep inner journey. She began meditating, reading philosophy, and spending time alone. Not because she was grieving, but because something deeper within her was rising. And then, like so many others, she began to feel disinterested in everything. Even writing her lifelong passion no longer pulled her out of bed in the morning. Friends grew concerned. Some suggested she see a therapist. And yes, through a clinical lens, all the signs pointed to depression, but there was one very important difference. Linda didn't feel pain. She wasn't blaming herself. She didn't feel guilty or worthless. She was simply quiet. And that's the subtle but deeply important difference. Depression is when life energy has drained away, the soul is in pain, self-worth collapses, and at times there's no longer a will to exist. Post-awakening, however, is when you temporarily lose interest in the things that once defined you, not because you're useless, but because you're caught between 2 lives, one that has dissolved and one that is slowly, deeply forming. Carl Jung once said, "What we call normal is often the very sickness we should be afraid of." Sometimes it's not you who's unwell, but the rushing world around you, and your slowing down might be the soul's most necessary step forward. You don't always have to be okay by the world's standards. Sometimes silence is healing, and emptiness isn't always a sign of collapse. Sometimes it's a clearing, making space for something more real to enter, but there's still one more quiet burden pressing on your shoulders. Modern culture has no language for the phase you're in, as this society moves too fast to allow for pause. It labels silence as depression and transformation as laziness. Let's keep moving into the next part. Why modern culture fears stillness and tries to pathologize it. Where we explore why stillness is seen as something to fear and what happens when you're no longer afraid to stop. We live in a culture that idolizes busyness. Think about it. When someone asks, "How have you been?" lately the most common response is, "So busy I can barely breathe." And that is treated like a badge of honor. The busier you are, the more valuable you seem. The faster you run, the more successful you appear. The less time you have to rest, the more important you must be. I once spoke with a man named Charles, 66 years old, a former lawyer in New York. After retiring, he moved to a lakeside home where he spent his days walking, reading, and watching clouds. He said, "I feel more peaceful than I ever have." But his friends didn't see it that way. One of them said, "You should find something to do or you'll start losing your spark. Sitting around all day, that's a fast track to depression." Charles laughed. "Funny, isn't it? When I was stressed, anxious, and losing sleep over work, no one worried. But now that I've slowed down and feel content, people think something's wrong." Modern culture doesn't know how to name stillness. It only has vocabulary for success, productivity growth, and optimization. But it has no words for deep rest, awakened stillness, or sitting quietly with oneself. And so when you pause, when you no longer feel the need to create value constantly, when you choose stillness, you will be misunderstood, even labeled. Carl Jung once warned, "The modern man is neurotic because he has lost contact with the symbolic life." Modern people often face crisis not because they lack things to do, but because they no longer know why they're doing them. We fear stillness because stillness exposes the questions the rush once kept hidden. Who am I living for? What do I truly want? Am I forgetting my soul in the midst of all these tasks? Stillness is not a sign of passivity. It is the space the soul needs to be reborn. If the world out there isn't ready for that, it doesn't mean you must return to the old race. Remember, even a forest needs winter to quietly prepare for its season of bloom. But if you no longer want to return to your old pace of life, if you've realized that your former goals no longer stir your heart, then you may be entering a vital phase of transformation, the stage where what once lit your fire now feels foreign. Or maybe you've simply outgrown what once drove you. Let's step into the next part. When goals no longer excite you, you've outgrown the fuel, where we explore what's really happening when your old passions no longer fit the soul that's growing within you. Something interesting happens after you awaken from your old rhythm. The things that once energized you each morning suddenly no longer move you. You look at your old to-do list, your 5-year plan that once gave you a sense of direction, and you see one thing: emptiness. This is when many people begin to wonder, am I going backward? Why am I no longer excited by my work, my goals, even the dreams I once had? And the answer might be simpler than you think. You haven't lost your motivation. You've just outgrown the fuel that once sustained you. I remember a woman named Mary Ann, 54 years old, once the owner of a highly successful yoga studio in California. She used to teach 6 classes a day, had hundreds of students, and was invited to speak at major wellness conferences. But after the pandemic, something began to shift. Instead of immersing herself in her teaching schedule and public image, she started spending more time at home journaling, tending her garden, meditating in silence. And then one day, while preparing to expand her studio, she suddenly realized she didn't feel any joy. I still know how to succeed, but I no longer see myself in it. We're rarely taught this. Motivation has a life cycle. Some goals are deeply true for us at certain points in time, but as your soul matures, those goals no longer feel deep or real enough. They're not wrong. They've simply fulfilled their role. Carl Jung once said, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning." The goals of your 30s may no longer be the fire of your 50s. And if you're quiet enough to listen, you'll feel that truth clearly. When your old goals no longer call your name, it's not a failure. It's an invitation to begin seeking a motivation that comes from alignment, not from fear of inadequacy. A drive that doesn't push you to prove, but simply invites you to express, not to climb higher, but to root deeper. But if what once ignited you no longer fits, then what will guide you next? There is another kind of motivation waiting for you. Quiet, unburdened by accolades, untouched by deadlines. It comes from a deep resonance with your truest self. Let's move into the next part. The rise of soul-driven motivation, how to recognize it, where you no longer need to run, but begin to walk, to the rhythm of your soul's own calling. After letting go of the old fuels, fame, achievements, recognition, there will be an extended void. And in that void, many people wait for inspiration to return the way it used to. A burst of ideas, a clear goal, a 12-step plan, but it doesn't come. Instead, something far subtler arises, like a whisper, a quiet sense of "this feels right," that logic can't explain. That is soul-driven motivation. It's not loud, it's not forceful, it carries no pressure. It doesn't command, it invites. And if you don't listen closely, you might miss it. I remember a man named Thomas, 61 years old, formerly a construction engineer. After awakening from a life filled with deadlines and blueprints, he began to feel out of place in the world of large-scale projects. One day, while walking through a forest near his home, he saw a young maple tree leaning over. For reasons he couldn't explain, he went back home, grabbed some twine, and propped the tree up, then returned each day to check on it. After a few weeks, he began tending the entire path. He picked up trash, cleared a small trail, planted flowers along the way. No one hired him. No one knew. No one paid him. "I don't know why I'm doing this," he said. "It's just that if I didn't, I'd feel like I was betraying something very real." That is the clearest sign of soul-driven motivation. You don't do it for the outcome. You do it because you can't not do it. Because if you don't walk in response to that calling, you feel your inner flame dimming. Carl Jung called this stage the emergence of the symbolic life, a life no longer centered on achieving something, but on living in integrity with who you truly are. Soul-driven motivation doesn't push you through fear, it guides you through resonance. You no longer run because you don't want to fall behind. You walk because every cell in you knows this is the right path, no explanation needed. But even as you begin to recognize this new kind of motivation, there's a subtle trap still lurking. Spiritual bypassing, when you float too far off the ground believing you're evolving, but in truth, you're avoiding real life. Let's move into the next part, embodiment versus escape, the danger of spiritual bypassing, where we learn how to stay grounded so the soul not only awakens, but also becomes fully present in every breath of ordinary life. After awakening, you begin to clearly see what's real and what's false. You recognize that ego, fame, and status are just surface layers. You withdraw from the old hustle, seeking stillness. All of that is a natural part of the process. But sometimes that retreat isn't a return to yourself. It's an escape from your true self in its new form. There's a very common trap, especially for those who awaken quickly: spiritual bypassing. You reject all low emotions, deny your anger, your pain, your wounds. You repeat phrases like, "Everything is an illusion, I'm not attached, I've transcended emotion." It sounds enlightened, but in truth it takes you further away from life rather than deeper into it. I once met a man named Eli, 59 years old, who had attended dozens of meditation retreats, read nearly everything by Eckhart Tolle and Ram Dass. He believed he was enlightened, but couldn't maintain a single close relationship. When his daughter came to him crying over her divorce, he gently replied, "Don't cling. Emotions are just illusions," and she walked away, never to return. That was the most painful moment Eli ever shared with me, when he realized he had used light as a veil to avoid facing the darkness within himself. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." True embodiment isn't about floating on mountaintops. It's about walking barefoot on the ground with all your honest emotions, sadness, anger, love, pain, and living through them consciously without defense. You don't need to be perfect, you just need to be present fully with yourself. True spirituality doesn't separate you from the world. It brings you back into life with a more awakened heart. Not to escape, but to engage, not to fly away, but to be more deeply here in each ordinary step. And when you're brave enough to stay with yourself fully, to resist retreating into false light, then something strange begins to happen. You feel energy return, but it's not the old kind, not frantic, not urgent, not driven, but a quiet movement from within. Let's explore that in the next part, building a new inner compass, small practices that guide you home, where we'll walk through simple practices that reconnect you to yourself, not through theory but through daily lived experience. After shedding your old roles, after stepping away from external motivation, and even after navigating the trap of spiritual bypassing, you'll come to realize one thing: you need a new compass, not to achieve anything, but to know when you're living in alignment with yourself. This new compass isn't found on any map. It's embedded in small, daily practices that bring you back inside, help you listen to yourself, and little by little, guide you home. I once asked a close friend, a psychotherapist with over 30 years of experience, after all the therapy techniques, analytical models, is there one simple but effective thing you often recommend to clients? She simply smiled and said, "Writing." "Writing?" I asked, surprised. "Yes. Every morning before touching your phone, just handwrite 2-3 pages of anything. No editing, no analyzing. Just let what's in your heart spill onto the page." I tried it, and I understood why. Because in the silence of the page, we no longer perform. There's no one to answer to, no need to appear wise. It's just you with yourself, and something inside you begins to return. Another friend named Maria shared a practice just as simple. Each night before bed, she places a hand on her chest and asks herself, "Did I betray anything inside me today?" Not to judge herself, but to stay honest with who she is. She told me that on nights when she forced herself to be cheerful at a gathering she didn't want to attend or agreed to something she didn't truly mean, her heart would ache just a little, like a gentle reminder. Next time, choose more truthfully. The inner compass isn't complicated. It's built from very small, very real moments. A cup of tea slowly sipped, a walk without a phone, a deep breath when emotions rise instead of reacting. A soft gaze toward yourself when you fail. Each small act is like placing a stone upon the ground, and slowly, you begin to rebuild your inner home. You don't need to figure out your life purpose right away. You just need to begin listening to yourself through each act of slow, honest living. And little by little, the things that are meant for you will step into the light. And then one day you'll notice, without anyone pushing you, without a detailed plan, you begin to move again, but no longer running. It's a natural response to life, to yourself. It's no longer the old kind of motivation, but a new source of energy, one that comes from wholeness. And that is exactly where this journey is leading you. Let's take the final step together, from lost to aligned. How this void is the beginning of wholeness. Where we realize the emptiness isn't the end. It is where true life begins. There's a subtle paradox that only those who've gone deep enough truly understand. Feeling lost is sometimes the very first sign that you're on the right path. It may sound contradictory, but when you've stripped away every mask, when you no longer live to please anyone, when all your old roles have fallen away, what remains sometimes is a vast emptiness. And in that emptiness, it's easy to think you're off track, that you're adrift. But the truth is, you're not lost. You've just stopped forcing yourself to go somewhere. You are returning to yourself in a quiet, unnamed way. And that is the beginning of inner alignment, a wholeness that doesn't come from adding more, but from removing what you are not. I once met a woman named Grace in her 60s, a former financial advisor who used to live with a plan for everything. When she entered the awakening journey, she no longer felt drawn to meetings, investments, or even the projects that once brought her prestige. For a while, she felt confused, even ashamed, because she was no longer useful like before. But instead of forcing herself back into the old rhythm, she began to listen to the small things. She learned pottery, wrote handwritten letters to old friends, grew vegetables, brewed tea, and sat quietly each morning. "I've never felt more real," she said. "I'm no longer busy, but I'm present. And that feels fuller than anything I had before." Carl Jung called this state individuation, the process in which each person begins to live not as what society expects them to be, but as who they were truly born to become. No more performing, no more chasing, no more proving, just being with the full truth inside. When you stop seeking clarity as a final destination, you begin to realize it's the silence itself that's been guiding you all along. Not through a roadmap, but through resonance. Not through pressure, but through a gentle whisper. Live as your true self, little by little. And if you're in that in-between space where there's no applause, no signposts, no roles to play, know this: you are not lost. You are being reborn. And when something real begins to rise, a thing you want to do with no reason, a person you want to love, without performing a way of living that brings peace to your chest, follow it. No rush, no need for perfection, just truth. If something in what you've just heard touched a part of you, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next inner journey.